Meghan Markle is left in tears as King Charles makes the most devastating move yet, erasing Archie and Lilibet from the official royal line of succession. In a decision sending shockwaves through the monarchy and beyond, King Charles has officially removed Prince Harry and Meghan Markle's children, Archie and Lilibet, from the royal succession registry. The announcement came quietly, but its implications are thunderous. What prompted this sudden and cold maneuver? Why now? And what does this mean for the future of Harry and Meghan's family? As insiders leak new details, we uncover the emotional fallout behind palace gates, a decision years in the making, and how this latest royal strike could fracture the family beyond repair. Stay with us. What you're about to hear may forever change how the world sees Britain's most powerful family. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. The heavy gates of Buckingham Palace stood as they always had, immovable, symbolic, unyielding. But on this particular morning, they concealed a silence that felt less like calm and more like the eye of a storm. The British monarchy, one of the oldest and most closely watched institutions in the world, had just made a seismic decision. And for Meghan Markle, the Duchess of Sussex, it would be the moment everything shattered. Her children, Archie and Lilibet, had been officially removed from the royal line of succession registry. They no longer existed on the official rolls. To the monarchy, they had become invisible. And for a mother who had endured years of criticism, scrutiny, and relentless media warfare, this wasn't just a bureaucratic update. It was erasure. The world learned of the decision early that morning through an understated, nearly clinical update on the royal family's official website. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. But it was cold. The names of Archie Harrison Mountbatten-Windsor and Lilibet Diana Mountbatten-Windsor had simply vanished from the list of those in line for the British throne. There was no statement from King Charles. No press conference. No explanation. Just silence. That silence would roar across continents within hours, setting social media ablaze and leaving millions to ask the same question. Why now? Behind the scenes, sources close to the palace whispered that this was no accident. This was no clerical revision. It was deliberate, and it was final. For King Charles III, who had long tried to project a modernized, streamlined monarchy, the decision was a statement. Archie and Lilibet, he believed, belonged to a world that had turned its back on royal duty. In a reign already marked by crises ranging from Prince Andrew's scandals to his own delicate health, Charles had made it clear that the future of the monarchy must be lean, loyal, and unquestionably aligned with the crown. Meghan and Harry, in his view, had broken the contract, and their children were now collateral damage. But to understand the full weight of this decision, one must look backward to the fairy tale that once was. When Meghan Markle first entered the royal family, she did so as a symbol of progress. An American actress, a woman of color, and a powerful voice for philanthropy and social justice, her marriage to Prince Harry captivated millions. The wedding was a dazzling display of multicultural celebration, televised globally and celebrated as a sign that the House of Windsor was finally evolving with the times. Then came the slow unraveling. Rumors of infighting, clashes with palace aides, and the relentless barrage of British tabloids transformed the fairy tale into a tragedy in real time. Meghan spoke of suicidal thoughts. Harry spoke of trauma. And then, in a historic interview with Oprah Winfrey, the couple laid bare their side of the story. Allegations of racism, betrayal, and institutional coldness that shook the monarchy to its core. After stepping back as senior royals and moving to the United States, they became global celebrities in their own right. But with that independence came a price. The ties were fraying. Now, they appear to have been severed entirely. For King Charles, this moment has been building since the day Harry and Meghan left. Royal insiders suggest he views the Sussexes as no longer tethered to the obligations and expectations that bind the rest of the royal family. They signed Netflix deals, spoke at political events, released memoirs, and podcast personal details that, in Charles's view, should have remained within palace walls. The monarch, ever conscious of legacy and the preservation of the crown, likely saw the continued inclusion of Archie and Lilibet in the line of succession as a contradiction. How could children raised in a private American household, with no formal ties to the monarchy, one day ascend to the throne? Yet the removal of their names is more than just symbolic. It's deeply personal. And for Meghan, it's a wound that may never heal. Sources close to the Duchess revealed that she broke down in tears upon hearing the news. While she had made peace with being an outsider, the removal of her children felt cruel and calculated. According to a friend, Meghan whispered, "They didn't just erase names. They erased our place in history." It's a powerful statement, one that underscores the emotional gravity of what many royal watchers are calling the coldest move yet under Charles's reign. And what of Harry? The prince who once walked behind his mother's coffin in front of the world, who served in the military with distinction, and who sought to build a life of meaning beyond the constraints of royal tradition. Insiders say he was furious, but he was also resigned. This was not the first time he felt his family had chosen image over kinship. The only difference now was that the consequences had reached his children. Friends say he spent hours pacing in their Montecito home, trying to explain the unexplainable to his young son. Archie reportedly asked why his name had been taken away. How does a father answer that? Outside the family, public opinion has splintered. Some hail the move as a necessary step towards slimming down the monarchy and protecting its integrity. Others see it as a petty act of vengeance from a monarch unable to accept dissent. Pundits across media platforms debated the implications. Was this even legal? Could Parliament intervene? Should they? The debate raged, but the decision remained firm. The royal family offered no further comment. Their silence, as ever, spoke volumes. There is also the question of legacy. For King Charles, a monarch ascending the throne later in life than any of his predecessors, legacy is everything. His reign is expected to be one of consolidation rather than expansion. He wants to be remembered as the man who modernized the monarchy, restored its dignity, and corrected course after decades of scandal. But in trying to do so, has he sacrificed compassion? Has he gone too far? And what message does this send to future generations? That blood alone is not enough? That lineage can be redefined by geography and publicity contracts? The monarchy, for all its pomp and tradition, has always been rooted in the idea of continuity, of passing the torch from one generation to the next, regardless of personal friction. By removing Archie and Lilibet, Charles may have created a precedent no monarch before him dared to set. If titles and places in line can be revoked, what else can be undone? As the news cycle churns and the world reacts, Meghan Markle remains largely silent. Her last public appearance before the decision was made showed her smiling at a charity event, radiant and poised. But insiders say she's devastated. She feels isolated, betrayed, not just by a family she once tried to join, but by an institution that promised stability and delivered exile. For the public, the removal of two innocent children from royal recognition is a stark reminder that even fairy tales come with fine print. Behind the gilded walls and centuries-old traditions lies a system capable of breathtaking coldness. And for Meghan, it was never about crowns or castles. It was about protection, about ensuring her children felt a connection to the legacy their father was born into. That dream now seems lost. And so the story begins not with a crown, but with a silence that speaks of distance, disillusionment, and deliberate separation. The question now is not just what comes next for the royal family, but whether this decision marks the beginning of the end for any hope of reconciliation. The damage has been done. The names are gone. And for Meghan Markle, the tears are very real. Behind the polished speeches and photo ops of the British royal family exists a complex machinery of decision-making, strategic, discreet, and often ruthless. The decision to remove Meghan Markle and Prince Harry's children from the royal line of succession registry was not made impulsively. It was the culmination of months, possibly years, of private conversations, strategic whispers, and classified meetings between senior royals, palace aides, legal advisors, and courtiers. Though the public only learned of the decision when the royal website quietly updated its succession list, the machinery behind it had been in motion for quite some time. It all began in the months following King Charles III's coronation. Though the ceremony was hailed as a symbol of stability and tradition, there were tensions boiling just beneath the surface. According to insiders, one of the earliest priorities of King Charles's new reign was to streamline and modernize the monarchy. This didn't merely mean cutting costs or trimming ceremonial roles. It meant redefining who was in, who was out, and what the future of the crown would look like. For Charles, the events of the last few years had created an existential crisis for the monarchy. The infamous Oprah interview, the release of Harry's memoir Spare, the Netflix docuseries, and even subtle critiques of royal traditions had painted a portrait of dysfunction and fracture. Though Meghan and Harry resided thousands of miles away in California, their voices echoed loudly in the United Kingdom. To Charles and his senior advisors, this created an optics problem. How could the monarchy preserve its credibility when its own members were publicly dismantling its image? Behind closed doors at Clarence House and later Buckingham Palace, a series of private meetings began. Senior figures including Queen Camilla, Prince William, and key palace advisors like Sir Edward Young and Clive Alderton were reportedly involved. These meetings, often conducted in absolute secrecy, were focused on one key question: should the children of Meghan and Harry maintain their position in the royal line of succession? On paper, Archie and Lilibet were legally in line to the throne, regardless of their parents' roles. As the children of Prince Harry, they were naturally part of the lineage. But in practice, royal protocol is not governed solely by blood. It is shaped by precedent, perception, and politics. The question wasn't whether they could remain in the line, but whether they should. And more importantly, whether the monarchy could afford to allow it. According to palace sources, Queen Camilla was a strong advocate for re-evaluating the succession list. She believed the inclusion of Archie and Lilibet created a dangerous precedent, one where future royals might assume entitlement without responsibility. She reportedly argued that royal titles and privileges should not extend to those living completely outside the institution, particularly if their parents had openly criticized and distanced themselves from the crown. Prince William, while initially hesitant, eventually came around to the idea. His relationship with his brother had deteriorated beyond repair, and he reportedly viewed the Sussexes' public attacks as harmful to the monarchy's long-term reputation. As a future king, William is said to be highly conscious of how the institution is perceived both in Britain and around the world. Allowing Harry's children to remain in the line of succession while they were raised in America, disconnected from royal life and immersed in Hollywood culture, was a contradiction he could no longer reconcile. At the heart of these talks was also the legal question. Could the monarchy legally remove names from the line of succession without parliamentary intervention? The answer, according to royal constitutional experts, is nuanced. The Succession to the Crown Act 2013 governs the rules of succession, but the royal family retains some discretionary power over the way its internal registry is managed. While Parliament would need to pass legislation to alter the legal order of succession in any binding way, the symbolic removal from the official registry was within the Crown's domain. And in this case, symbolism was everything. Sources indicate that it was Sir Clive Alderton, Charles's most trusted private secretary, who ultimately drafted the proposal. The draft document reportedly outlined the rationale for the removal, citing an irrevocable departure from the expectations of royal service, prolonged absence from royal duties, and the establishment of an independent and commercially driven public identity. In other words, the Sussexes had not just left the family, they had turned themselves into a brand, and that, to the Crown, was unacceptable. Weeks before the registry was updated, Charles reportedly sought legal advice to ensure the move would not provoke a constitutional crisis. Lawyers assured him that while critics might object, the action would not violate any standing law. What mattered was that the move was seen as both proportionate and in the interest of protecting the integrity of the institution. With that assurance, Charles gave the order to proceed. Interestingly, the final push reportedly came during a confidential conversation between Charles and the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby. Though primarily spiritual, their discussions are known to shape royal policy. During the conversation, Charles reportedly expressed anguish about the path his son had taken, but affirmed that duty must come before sentiment. The Archbishop, according to insiders, advised Charles to act in a manner consistent with his conscience and his calling as sovereign, to uphold the monarchy, even at personal cost. And so, the machinery moved. In early spring, palace staff initiated a comprehensive review of the royal website and public-facing documents. Communications teams were instructed to prepare for potential backlash, but were told not to issue a formal statement unless absolutely necessary. The instruction was clear: make the change quietly, and let the world interpret it on its own. On the day of the update, few in the palace spoke openly, but there was a distinct atmosphere of tension. Staffers whispered in corridors, wondering whether the Sussexes had been warned. According to some sources, Meghan and Harry were not informed in advance. They discovered the change like everyone else, by checking the royal website. Whether this was intentional or an oversight remains debated, but for Meghan, it felt like a betrayal carried out in the shadows. In Montecito, The mood was described as somber and tense. Meghan reportedly went into a state of emotional withdrawal, speaking only to a few close confidants. Harry, torn between his loyalty to his wife and his residual sense of duty to his family, was said to be livid but strangely unsurprised. To him, this was the culmination of a campaign of exclusion that had started the moment he and Meghan chose a different path. The fallout was immediate. Journalists around the world noticed the change within hours. Twitter erupted with hashtags. Morning shows dedicated entire segments to the removal. In Britain, the BBC offered a brief but stark acknowledgement of the edit, while American networks ran primetime specials. Royal commentators, some of whom had defended Charles in the past, found themselves divided. Was this the firm hand of a king setting boundaries, or a cold move against innocent children? Behind the palace walls, damage control efforts were quietly deployed. Advisors monitored media coverage closely, taking note of rising criticisms and support. Surprisingly, the move garnered approval among some segments of the British public, who felt the monarchy had been too lenient with the Sussexes. Others, especially younger audiences and viewers in the United States, expressed outrage, viewing the decision as petty and vindictive. But inside the House of Windsor, the die had been cast. There would be no reversal. Charles, for all his complexities and contradictions, had made a definitive move, one that could not be undone without signaling weakness. In the weeks that followed, private briefings were held to reassure key Commonwealth nations and allies that the monarchy was not in crisis. Diplomats were dispatched discreetly to explain the context to governments where the issue might raise concern. Still, questions lingered. What does this mean for the future of the monarchy? Will other non-working royals face similar erasure? And most crucially, will this decision become the final wedge between the two royal brothers, making reconciliation impossible? As the dust begins to settle, one thing is clear. This was not merely a technical edit to a website. It was a bold declaration, a line drawn in the sand by a king who has decided that the time for diplomacy is over. The monarchy, in Charles's vision, must be purified of contradiction. And that means painful choices, even if they come at the cost of his own blood. The moment Meghan Markle learned that her children had been quietly removed from the official royal line of succession registry was not through a formal letter or phone call, but rather a series of alerts pinging her phone. News apps, Twitter threads, a mention on a morning talk show. The absence of formal communication struck her as a brutal insult, a final erasure of any thread that might have connected her children to the British monarchy. And for Meghan, who has fought tooth and nail to define her identity and her children's place in the world, this was more than a bureaucratic move. It was a declaration of war. The initial reaction was disbelief. Meghan reportedly reread the headline multiple times before even speaking. The royal website, once a ceremonial reference, had now become a battlefield. The names of Archie and Lilibet, once prominently listed, had vanished from their place in the public order of succession. Their positions were not reassigned or footnoted. They were simply removed, erased without explanation. For Meghan, this felt not just like rejection, but retaliation. In their Montecito mansion, the atmosphere changed instantly. The walls that had once offered sanctuary from the British tabloid press now echoed with tension. Meghan walked through the hallways with her phone in hand, face tense, scanning for official confirmation. None came. No email from Buckingham Palace. No call from King Charles. Not even a message from a palace aide. The silence was deafening. According to sources close to the Duchess, she was initially numb. Hours passed before her composure began to crack. When she finally spoke, it was with a clipped, icy tone. They did it, she reportedly said, eyes fixed on the screen. They really did it. What followed, however, was not a meltdown. Meghan had grown accustomed to betrayal, but this struck at the heart of what she held most dear, her children. For all the criticisms lobbed at her over the years, Meghan had maintained a consistent narrative. Everything she did for Archie and Lilibet. She had withstood public smearing, relentless press intrusion, and the breakdown of familial ties under the pretense of protecting their mental health, their privacy, their futures. And now, despite those efforts, the monarchy had made its stance clear. Archie and Lilibet, in the eyes of the institution, no longer mattered. Within hours, Meghan initiated a series of phone calls. First to her legal team, then to her public relations advisors, and eventually to Oprah Winfrey. It was not yet clear whether she intended to speak publicly, but she wanted her closest allies on standby. One source close to Meghan described her as calculating in the storm. She wasn't going to lash out in anger. She was going to respond with strategy. Meanwhile, Harry was reportedly furious. Unlike Meghan, who viewed the monarchy through the lens of racial and cultural alienation, Harry felt the betrayal on a deeply personal level. It wasn't just his children who had been erased, it was a part of him. Though his relationship with his family had been fractured for years, he still held out hope for reconciliation. This move, however, made that hope feel delusional. According to insiders, the couple had a tense, emotionally charged discussion in the early hours of the morning. Meghan allegedly asked Harry, "How could they do this without telling us?" Harry, silent for a moment, simply said, "Because they think they don't have to anymore." That simple sentence captured the chilling realization: the monarchy had moved on without them. Privately, Meghan was also said to be wrestling with guilt, not because she believed she had done something wrong, but because of what this removal symbolized for her children. In their early years, Archie and Lilibet had already become symbols in the war between tradition and progress, monarchy and individualism, race and power. And now, they were paying the price for decisions made long before they were old enough to understand them. Those closest to Meghan said she was deeply reflective in the days following the registry change. She revisited her old journals, scrolled through photos of her children's early milestones, and reread correspondence she once had with palace officials. She was reportedly struck by the emotional disconnect between her memories and the cold, calculated action the palace had taken. Publicly, Meghan remained silent for the moment, but the machinery behind her began to stir. Her PR advisors were tasked with gauging media sentiment. Sympathetic journalists were briefed. Anonymous sources began offering quotes. Though Meghan had not made an official statement, the narrative was being quietly shaped: a mother blindsided, a family punished, a monarchy showing its true colors. A major dilemma, however, loomed. Should Meghan speak out directly? Should she sit down for another interview and address the decision head-on? Or would doing so only amplify the divide, turning a quiet erasure into a full-scale war? Behind the scenes, opinions varied. Some advisors urged restraint. They argued that the best revenge would be dignity, remaining above the fray while public sentiment gradually shifted in her favor. Others believed silence would be interpreted as weakness or, worse, admission. In the end, the decision would be hers alone. The emotional toll was undeniable. Friends noticed Meghan eating less, sleeping sporadically, and retreating into intense focus. She poured herself into her children, spending long hours with Archie and Lilibet, shielding them from the media frenzy. But even in those quiet moments, her mind raced. What would she tell them when they were older? How would she explain that their removal was not about their worth, but about an institution trying to protect itself? The situation was further complicated by the racial undertones that had long defined Meghan's experience with the monarchy. Though the palace offered no official reasoning for the removal, Meghan and many others could not ignore the uncomfortable question: would this have happened if Archie and Lilibet had been white? That question was not just rhetorical. It became a point of debate across the media landscape. Commentators on both sides of the Atlantic weighed in. Some framed the removal as a logical step for an institution trying to protect its brand. Others saw it as the latest manifestation of a monarchy unwilling to evolve, clinging to outdated hierarchies that exclude more than they include. In the U.S., Meghan's supporters grew louder. Activists, academics, and celebrities began to post statements of support. The removal became more than just a royal drama. It became a cultural flashpoint. For millions of women of color, Meghan's story had always resonated. Now, with her children caught in the crossfire, the stakes felt even higher. Back in Montecito, Meghan began contemplating her next move. According to sources, one option under discussion was a documentary, one focused not on her own life, but on the broader issue of monarchy and succession in the modern age. She wanted to tell a story that connected her children's removal to a larger pattern, an institution failing to embrace the world as it is. Another option floated was a private legal challenge. While difficult and unlikely to reverse the decision, such a move could send a message: Meghan was not going to allow her children to be written out of history without a fight. Her legal team began researching precedents and examining international human rights angles. Even if the monarchy was above challenge in the UK, the court of global opinion remained open. In moments of reflection, Meghan reportedly confided in a close friend that she now felt a kind of clarity she hadn't felt since leaving the UK. "I always thought we might one day go back," she said. "But now I see, we were never meant to." That realization wasn't just emotional, it was existential. The line of succession had been Meghan's last tether to the monarchy, however symbolic. Its quiet severance felt like the monarchy's final verdict on her family. Not royal, not welcome, not remembered. And yet, despite the pain, Meghan was not broken. If anything, those around her said, she had grown more resolute. She wasn't just a woman scorned, she was a mother preparing to rewrite the legacy her children had been denied. The question now wasn't just how she would respond, but when. Because Meghan knew the world was watching, and she would not remain silent forever. Inside the secluded estate of Montecito, the calm of California's coastal paradise was shattered by a fury that had been building for years. Prince Harry, Duke of Sussex, was no longer the restrained royal trained to hold composure in the face of injustice. Behind closed doors, following the news of Archie and Lilibet's removal from the royal line of succession, Harry exploded, not just with grief, but with a volcanic rage that few outside his inner circle had ever seen. The news struck Harry like a gut punch. He had always known there was tension with his family. He had walked away from the monarchy after all, but this felt different. This was not a cold shoulder or passive-aggressive silence. This was an active measure. A public, irreversible act. The monarchy had decided that his children, his blood, were unworthy of their legacy, and they had done so without the decency of informing him. Harry's reaction began not with words, but silence. A long, chilling silence as he stared at the same royal website that once heralded his wedding and announced the birth of his son. Now, it carried no trace of Archie and Lilibet's rightful positions in the family hierarchy. His eyes fixated on the list. George, Charlotte, Louis. Then a leap over what had once been his children's names to the next heir, confirming the erasure. He sat in his home office, the soft glow of the computer screen casting harsh shadows on his face. Meghan had entered the room quietly, placing a hand on his shoulder. For a moment, he didn't move. Then, in a tone that was low and fractured, he asked, "What kind of father lets this happen?" The question was directed inward as much as it was toward his family. For Harry, this wasn't just about tradition. It was about identity. He had been raised to believe in duty, lineage, the continuation of the House of Windsor. Now, his children had been cast out of that very house, not for anything they had done, but simply for who their mother was and the choices Harry had made to protect them. Then came the anger. Reports from inside their Montecito residence paint a picture of a man pacing furiously, phone in hand, shaking with disbelief. He began making calls to confidants in Britain, former aides, trusted friends, even distant family members still sympathetic to his plight. He demanded answers. Most had none to give. A few hadn't even been aware of the change until Harry pointed it out. The silence from Buckingham Palace was all the confirmation he needed. This wasn't a clerical error. It was deliberate. Harry reportedly punched a wall in his private gym out of sheer frustration. It wasn't about the titles. He had walked away from those. It was about what the removal represented, a declaration from his father, King Charles, that Archie and Lilibet did not count, not in the eyes of the crown, not in the eyes of history, that they would be remembered only as outsiders, even though royal blood ran through their veins. The betrayal cut deepest coming from Charles. For all the criticism Harry had leveled at his father in the past, he still believed that blood carried a sacred bond. He had hoped that, at the very least, Charles would distinguish between his anger toward Meghan and his duty to his grandchildren. But that illusion shattered with a single web update. According to a former royal aide who remained close to Harry, the Duke said, "He's not just erasing them. He's erasing me." It was a recognition that the act wasn't simply administrative. It was symbolic. A line drawn through an entire branch of the family tree. And it was done publicly, without warning, in a way that would be dissected endlessly by the global press. Harry's fury wasn't just directed at his father. He felt betrayed by William as well. His older brother, the man he had once idolized, had offered no word of defense. William, with 3 children safely embedded in the line of succession, had every opportunity to advocate for fairness, for unity. But William remained silent, just as he had through so many controversies over the years. In one particularly emotional conversation with a friend, Harry reportedly said, "He's already the heir. Why take this from my kids? What do they gain by doing this?" The friend had no answer. Because there was none, at least, none rooted in decency. In the days that followed, Harry withdrew from public life almost entirely. Cancelled calls. Ignored emails. He spent long hours walking the hills near his Montecito home, accompanied only by his dogs. Those who saw him described a man consumed with thoughts he couldn't escape. He would stop mid-stride, stare into the distance, fists clenched at his sides. At home, he became more protective of Archie and Lilibet than ever. He watched them play with a haunted look in his eyes, as if trying to memorize every moment, fearing they would be rewritten out of existence. At night, he would tiptoe into their rooms and sit quietly by their beds, watching them sleep, wrestling with the knowledge that their royal birthright had been taken from them without their knowledge. But anger alone was never going to satisfy Harry. He needed to act. Within the week, he instructed his legal team to examine whether the monarchy had overstepped any legal bounds. It was a long shot. Royal prerogative often goes unchallenged, but Harry wasn't concerned with court victories. He was preparing for a public reckoning. Behind the scenes, he also began drafting a statement. It was raw, filled with pain and defiance, but advisors urged him to wait. Let the public outrage build, they said. Let the press dissect it. Then strike when the world is listening. Harry agreed for the moment, but his restraint had a ticking clock. Sources say that during a private meeting with a senior American journalist he trusted, Harry laid out his feelings with uncharacteristic candor. I left to protect my family. I knew there would be consequences, but I didn't think they'd come for my children. His voice cracked, but he pressed on. This isn't about duty anymore. This is about legacy. They're trying to erase mine. The journalist, moved by the raw emotion, described the encounter as one of the most intense interviews of their career. Harry didn't weep. He didn't yell. But there was a weight in the room that was impossible to ignore. The weight of history colliding with a father's heartbreak. The relationship between Harry and the rest of the royal family, already strained, entered new territory. Sources from within the palace said Charles refused to take Harry's calls following the removal. Messages went unanswered. Letters returned unopened. It was as if the king had made a permanent decision to treat Harry as an outsider. Not just a prodigal son, but a mistake to be contained. In response, Harry began laying plans for a public initiative that would further cement his new identity, one separate from the monarchy. He began coordinating with humanitarian organizations, expanding his work with veterans, and pushing forward with projects that would ensure his legacy did not depend on a royal title. The world had tried to define him as the spare. Now, he was determined to redefine himself as something far greater, a father, a protector, and a challenger of unjust power. In private, he remained devastated. But publicly, he was steeling himself. A reckoning was coming, and Harry would not be silent. As Prince Harry navigated his storm of anger and grief, Meghan Markle was undergoing a transformation of her own, a shift from deep personal pain to strategic retaliation. Behind the elegant gates of their Montecito mansion, Meghan's fury was not as explosive as Harry's, but it was far from quiet. Hers was a measured fire, simmering beneath layers of poise, shaped by years of calculated resilience, media warfare, and political survival. When Meghan first learned of Archie and Lilibet's removal from the royal line of succession, her reaction was visceral. The betrayal was not just personal, it was systemic. She stood frozen in the family's living room, eyes locked on the royal website, lips parted in disbelief. The news broke like an unspoken curse, a complete severing of the ties her children once had to the institution that had tormented her. But instead of letting that wound fester into helplessness, Meghan did what she had always done in the face of injustice. She turned the pain into power. In the initial moments, Meghan's fury was inward. She walked to her study, closed the door, and sat in silence for nearly an hour. A notebook lay open before her, one of many she kept since stepping back from royal life. She jotted notes in tight cursive, her pen moving with purpose. Dates, names, instances, conversations. She was not just mourning a betrayal. She was documenting it. A pattern was emerging, one she believed stretched far beyond petty royal politics and into a targeted effort to erase her children's identity. That night, Meghan confided in a close friend over a secure video call. The friend, a well-known black political strategist, later shared anonymously that Meghan's tone was unmistakably resolute. They think they've shut the door, but what they've done is open 100 new ones for me. Meghan reportedly said she would not go quietly, and that her children's place in the world would not be defined by an antiquated institution built on selective memory and systemic bias. In the days that followed, Meghan met with her team of legal advisors and media consultants. It wasn't a reaction of panic, but a preemptive strategy. Meghan understood the public landscape better than most royals. She knew how to shape narratives, how to time releases, and most importantly, how to weaponize the truth. Her first directive was simple: analyze the legal language surrounding royal succession. Though she knew challenging it formally would be fruitless, the monarchy was largely exempt from judicial review. Meghan was interested in precedent. Had there ever been another royal child removed from the line without consent or cause? Could the palace provide justification under the Crown's own succession policies? The answers were vague, evasive, and most importantly, conveniently unwritten. Meghan began compiling evidence, not for court, but for the court of public opinion. Her next step was more calculated. She re-engaged with prominent American media platforms that had previously courted her for interviews. Requests for her exclusive were frequent, but she had always hesitated. Now, she was ready. But instead of one explosive tell-all, she envisioned a series of conversations carefully spaced, focused on broader issues like motherhood, racial identity, and institutional accountability. She wanted to shift the focus from the palace to the real consequences of exclusion, on children, on women, on modern society. The messaging was intentional. Meghan didn't want sympathy. She wanted change. She began quietly laying the groundwork for a documentary centered around lineage and identity, using her children's story as the anchor. The project, reportedly in early development with one of Hollywood's top producers, would weave together personal experience with a broader critique of hereditary power structures. It wouldn't mention Charles or William by name, but their shadows would be unmistakable. Yet, even as Meghan built her response from a public-facing angle, she was internally devastated. Those closest to her said the betrayal reminded her of the darkest moments of her royal life, when headlines turned her into a villain, when family dinners became silent battlefields, when she felt alone in palaces filled with people. Her children had become collateral damage in a war she thought was over. She watched Archie play in the garden with a quiet sense of dread. How would he feel, years from now, knowing his name had been erased from a lineage he was born into? Would he blame her? Would he understand? Meghan, who had built a career on giving voice to the voiceless, now found herself desperate to give her own children the one thing she never truly had within the royal family: a secure place. Her fury wasn't just about status. It was about identity. Meghan understood more than anyone that titles and placement in a royal hierarchy meant nothing in the real world unless they served as symbols of something greater. For her children, that symbolism had been stripped away. The monarchy had sent a clear message: Archie and Lilibet didn't belong. Meghan's mind began to shift toward long-term retaliation, not of the vindictive kind, but through visibility, empowerment, and legacy building. If her children were not to be royals, she would make sure they were something bigger, leaders in their own right, icons of resilience. She began coordinating with several civil rights organizations behind the scenes, seeking alliances that could support initiatives tied to children's rights and identity politics. Meghan wanted to redefine the very meaning of legacy. She envisioned a global summit on modern monarchy and justice, a platform where historians, activists, and public figures could debate the future of royal institutions. It was ambitious, but so was she. And now, she had the motivation to pursue it with full force. Still, beneath the layers of planning and power building, Meghan struggled with a quieter, more human ache. She felt the sting of rejection not just as a duchess or activist, but as a mother. She confided in her therapist that the removal of her children from the line of succession felt like erasure. "It's like they want to make it look like my children were never born," she reportedly said through tears. "Like I never existed there. Like none of us did." This internal conflict would become a defining part of her next chapter. Meghan was determined not to let the rage consume her. She couldn't afford to become the villain the tabloids painted her as. But she also couldn't remain silent, not after this. In a private strategy meeting with her team, Meghan reportedly said, "They drew a line. Now we show them where it ends." Her advisors nodded, fully aware that this wasn't just about a line of succession. It was about an emerging power struggle between the past and the future, between those clinging to legacy and those fighting for justice. The world would soon see a new version of Meghan Markle, sharper, unyielding, and meticulously prepared. She would not beg for a seat at the royal table. She would build her own and invite the world to sit with her. The world didn't sit quietly as news spread that King Charles had orchestrated the removal of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle's children from the royal line of succession. What began as hushed conversations in exclusive British clubs and royalist circles quickly exploded into international headlines. drawing outrage from every corner of the globe. Monarchists, Republicans, political leaders, human rights advocates, and ordinary citizens all reacted, some with calculated commentary, others with searing condemnation. In London, the BBC initially attempted to downplay the move. A series of carefully worded segments portrayed the decision as procedural, framed within the Crown's authority to alter the order of succession. Royal correspondents explained it as a necessary adjustment, given Prince Harry and Meghan's formal exit from royal duties. However, within 24 hours, the tide shifted. The media could not contain the growing discontent. Social media platforms were flooded with hashtags calling the act discriminatory, regressive, and cold-blooded. Across the Atlantic, American networks were far less restrained. CNN ran a segment titled "Monarchy or Monopoly? Are Royal Children Being Punished?" MSNBC brought on historians and legal scholars who questioned whether this was the monarchy's final break from modernity. On Fox News, even conservative anchors expressed discomfort with what they termed the king's petty and personal vendetta. Oprah Winfrey, who had previously hosted Meghan and Harry in their landmark interview, posted a cryptic but powerful tweet: "Children should never be tools of punishment. Ever." But perhaps the most piercing reaction came from political leaders outside the Commonwealth. In South Africa, where Meghan had spoken emotionally during her royal tour, a prominent member of parliament demanded the UK government publicly rebuke such shameful behavior. Canada's deputy prime minister labeled the decision deeply troubling, suggesting that if the British monarchy continues along this path, it risks eroding centuries of soft power and symbolic unity. In the Caribbean, where debates about removing the monarchy as head of state had already gained momentum, this incident became a rallying cry. Barbados had already broken away, and now Jamaica, St. Kitts and Nevis, and Belize saw a surge of public protests and parliamentary motions demanding full Republican transitions. A Jamaican senator stood before Parliament and said, "If their own grandchildren can be erased because of politics, what chance do our people have of being treated with dignity under this system?" Inside the United Nations, murmurs emerged among human rights circles. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights released a statement emphasizing that all children, regardless of status, ethnicity, or lineage, are entitled to the same protections and respect. Though the statement did not mention King Charles by name, the implication was clear. It was a warning shot, one that suggested the monarchy's actions were not simply internal affairs anymore. The backlash wasn't limited to political elites. Ordinary citizens across continents expressed dismay and disbelief. On TikTok, young activists posted side-by-side comparisons of how Prince Andrew, despite his controversial associations, remained in the royal fold, while two mixed-race children were effectively erased. Instagram was awash with tributes to Archie and Lilibet, with users labeling them the children the crown disowned. Petitions demanding that King Charles reverse his decision garnered millions of signatures within days. In response, Buckingham Palace found itself scrambling to control the narrative. Press officers issued a vague, carefully measured statement asserting that matters of succession are governed by constitutional convention and are not reflective of personal judgment. But it was too late. The world had already made its judgment, and many didn't like what they saw. King Charles, who had ascended the throne with hopes of modernizing and streamlining the monarchy, now found himself at the center of a firestorm. Behind palace walls, sources revealed that Charles was both bewildered and irritated by the scale of the backlash. He reportedly felt blindsided by the global outcry, insisting that his decision had been constitutionally sound and morally necessary to preserve the dignity and function of the crown. But those close to him knew the deeper truth. Charles had long harbored resentment toward Harry's defection, and even more so toward Meghan's relentless critique of the institution. The removal of their children from the line was more than symbolic. It was a message, a line drawn in the sand. And now, the world was pushing back. British tabloids, sensing blood in the water, turned their headlines into weapons. "King under fire," blared the Daily Mail. The Guardian took a more sobering tone: "The monarchy at a crossroads." Editorials poured in, questioning whether Charles truly understood the moment he was in. He had inherited not just a throne, but a global platform, and with it came a responsibility to reflect modern values. By choosing tradition over reconciliation, he had alienated an entire generation. In Australia, where Republican sentiment had simmered for decades, Prime Minister Emma Hollingsworth used the moment to reignite the national debate. She appeared before the press and declared, our nation stands at a moral juncture. We must ask ourselves, does the monarchy represent who we are today, or who we used to be? Even in the United States Senate, where foreign monarchy rarely entered political discussion, one prominent senator issued a statement expressing disappointment. We have always admired the British Crown's ability to adapt. What we're witnessing now is the opposite, an act of exclusion that undermines the very unity the monarchy claims to uphold. Meanwhile, academic circles worldwide took the opportunity to dissect the implications. Professors of constitutional law began writing papers questioning the ethical underpinnings of hereditary succession. Historians published essays comparing King Charles's move to past acts of dynastic purging in medieval Europe. The monarchy, once seen as a ceremonial relic with a benign image, was now being re-examined under the harsh light of global justice and racial equity. Behind closed doors, Charles convened a private council of senior royal advisors. The atmosphere was tense. Some urged him to issue a retraction or at least a clarification. Others believed doubling down would preserve the monarchy's authority. But Charles, known for his stubborn streak, was not easily swayed. He reportedly told one aide, "If I bend now, the crown bends forever." But even as he stood firm, his approval ratings dropped. Polls showed a dramatic decline in public trust. Support among younger Britons, already skeptical of the monarchy, plummeted. International surveys painted a bleak picture. Only 28% of Canadians viewed the crown as relevant, and fewer than 20% of Jamaicans supported remaining under the British sovereign. What was once a personal decision now had geopolitical consequences. Amid all this, Queen Camilla remained silent publicly but was reportedly furious in private. Sources close to the palace described heated exchanges between her and Charles. Camilla feared the fallout would irreparably damage the monarchy's credibility. She had worked hard to rehabilitate her own image over the years and now watched it unravel due to a decision she hadn't endorsed. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, added a surprising voice to the fray. In a sermon that was widely interpreted as a critique of the king's action, he spoke of the moral imperative to protect the innocent and warned against sacrificing the young on the altar of pride. Though not a direct condemnation, his words rang out across cathedrals and newsrooms alike. In Montecito, Prince Harry and Meghan Markle watched the uproar with mixed emotions. Vindication was laced with sorrow. While they had fought to shine a light on the monarchy's shortcomings, they never imagined it would come at the cost of their children's future. Still, the global support reminded them they were not alone. The world was watching, and in many corners, it was siding with them. The momentum of outrage was not slowing down. Protests broke out outside British embassies in several countries. In New York City, demonstrators held signs reading "Not My King" and "Stop Erasing Royal Children." In Nairobi, a candlelight vigil was held in solidarity with Meghan and her children, marking them not just as figures of celebrity, but of cultural and generational significance. As the days turned to weeks, pressure on King Charles only intensified. Calls for a formal response grew louder. Political leaders within the UK began voicing concern, especially those in Scotland and Northern Ireland where royal loyalty was already tenuous. Even within Parliament, quiet murmurs turned into open debate. In the end, King Charles faced a sobering reality. He had misjudged the world he now ruled. This was not 1952. This was a global age connected by social consciousness, moral scrutiny, and unforgiving transparency. His actions had awakened a sleeping conversation, not just about the future of the monarchy, but about its soul. The removal of Archie and Lilibet from the royal line of succession didn't just spark moral outrage, it ignited a storm of legal and constitutional debate that reached far beyond the gilded walls of Buckingham Palace. As news of King Charles's decision reverberated through Britain and across the world, constitutional scholars, legal experts, and political figures began dissecting the implications of what many saw as an unprecedented overreach of royal authority. At the heart of the controversy was one singular, explosive question. Did the monarch have the legal right to unilaterally remove royal descendants from the line of succession? Traditionally, the order of succession in the United Kingdom is governed by a combination of statute law and constitutional convention. The 1701 Act of Settlement, the Royal Marriages Act of 1772, the Succession to the Crown Act 2013, and various royal prerogatives outline who is eligible to inherit the throne. None of these laws, however, explicitly provide the reigning monarch the power to remove individuals at will, particularly those born into the line through a legitimate royal son, as in the case of Prince Harry's children. As the backlash escalated, Legal minds pounced on this ambiguity. Within days, Queen's counsels and constitutional historians appeared on radio and television panels to analyze the legality of Charles's decision. One leading expert from Oxford, Professor Amanda Rothschild, declared on BBC Radio 4, "If the king acted without legislative backing or without the advice and consent of Parliament, then this could be interpreted as unconstitutional and possibly illegal under current British law." The debate widened to include Parliament itself. Labour MPs demanded clarity and proposed an emergency review into the constitutional parameters of the monarchy. The Liberal Democrats joined in, warning against the rise of unchecked royal prerogatives. Even some conservative backbenchers expressed concern that the crown had overstepped its symbolic and ceremonial role. Prime Minister Lionel Gates, initially reluctant to intervene in what was considered a royal matter, was eventually forced to address the issue during Prime Minister's questions. "This government believes in the rule of law, and we are actively reviewing the constitutional implications of recent royal actions," he told a packed House of Commons. The room buzzed with tension, the murmur of disbelief underlying every exchange. Behind the scenes, civil servants from the Cabinet Office and legal advisors to the Crown were hurriedly preparing briefs on succession law. A confidential memo was leaked to the Times, revealing that the palace had not consulted Parliament or the Privy Council before making the announcement. This revelation caused a political firestorm, with multiple lawmakers calling it a constitutional crisis in the making. Across the legal landscape, other players entered the fray. International human rights lawyers began examining whether the move violated any conventions under the European Convention on Human Rights, particularly Article 14, which prohibits discrimination. Since Meghan Markle is biracial and both her children are of mixed heritage, some legal scholars raised the possibility that racial bias, whether explicit or systemic, could be argued in an international forum. In Strasbourg, a group of British and European human rights lawyers submitted a petition to the European Court of Human Rights, requesting an inquiry into whether the children's exclusion constituted discriminatory treatment on the basis of race and national origin. Though symbolic in nature, the petition gained traction, and international media outlets began reporting it as a potential landmark case in the intersection between monarchy and modern human rights law. Back in the UK, public pressure led to an urgent parliamentary inquiry. The House of Commons Select Committee on Constitutional Affairs launched an investigation into the King's decision. Members of the committee summoned constitutional experts, former Lord Chancellors, and representatives from the legal profession to testify. During the hearings, it became painfully clear that while the monarchy operated within a constitutional framework, the boundaries of its power were still murky in practice. One particularly explosive moment came when Lord Bernard Armitage, a former law lord, testified that, while the monarch is immune from prosecution, the legality of his decisions can still be subject to constitutional review. What we are witnessing is a dangerous precedent, one that could allow personal bias to masquerade as constitutional necessity. That statement was picked up and echoed across the UK's major newspapers, from the Times to the Mirror. Think tanks and academic institutions issued white papers overnight. The King's Privy Council, usually a ceremonial body, found itself under intense scrutiny. Members were questioned about whether they had been consulted or had approved the exclusion of the Sussex children from the succession. As the firestorm grew, comparisons to historical constitutional crises emerged. Journalists revisited moments like the abdication of Edward VIII in 1936 and the 1997 public backlash following Princess Diana's death, illustrating that the monarchy had weathered stormy seas before, but rarely one this rooted in legal legitimacy. Amid the legal confusion, one point became increasingly clear: there was no formal process, no documented legal mechanism, for removing someone from the line of succession without a legislative act, and no such act had been passed. The government hadn't voted. Parliament hadn't debated. The Queen's councillors had not been summoned. In the absence of legal authority, King Charles's action began to look less like a constitutional move and more like a personal vendetta cloaked in royal privilege. Within the royal household, panic set in. Palace aides began briefing sympathetic journalists with off-the-record comments suggesting that Charles had simply updated the line of succession to reflect the realities of Harry and Meghan's status. But that explanation failed to address the core legal issue. A monarch cannot rewrite succession without a constitutional process. The pressure culminated when the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom issued a rare public statement noting that while the judiciary could not interfere with royal prerogatives, it was open to reviewing constitutional irregularities if a formal petition were presented by Parliament. This subtle but powerful message hinted that the judiciary might be willing to step in, if pushed. Meanwhile, legal organizations in Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, where King Charles is also head of state, began investigating the implications of the UK's succession changes on their own constitutional frameworks. In Canada, a prominent constitutional law firm issued a report warning that the King's unilateral action could provoke legal challenges in Commonwealth realms where the rules of succession are legally entrenched. In Australia, Republican groups seized on the moment. A coalition of constitutional lawyers and senators from multiple parties filed a petition demanding a parliamentary review of whether King Charles had violated his duties as sovereign under the Australian Constitution. The petition, while largely symbolic, gained enormous traction and further fanned the flames of Republican sentiment in the region. One of the most dramatic developments came when an anonymous member of the House of Lords submitted a proposal to introduce a Royal Succession Oversight Act, a bill that would require any future changes to the line of succession to be approved by both houses of Parliament and formally reviewed by constitutional experts. Though the bill had little chance of passing in its initial form, it symbolized the growing demand for systemic reform. Legal advocacy groups in Britain began working with civil rights organizations to explore avenues for contesting the decision in domestic courts. While direct litigation against the Crown remained unlikely due to sovereign immunity, some activists proposed a judicial review process involving government departments that may have assisted or facilitated the announcement. As legal scholars continued to analyze the full ramifications, it became apparent that King Charles's decision had set in motion a constitutional reckoning. The monarchy, once considered above the fray of legal accountability, was now being dragged into the realm of modern law. No longer shielded by tradition alone, the Crown faced a new era. One where it's a. As legal scholars continued to analyze the full ramifications, it became apparent that King Charles's decision had set in motion a constitutional reckoning. The monarchy, once considered above the fray of legal accountability, was now being dragged into the realm of modern law. No longer shielded by tradition alone, the Crown faced a new era, one where its actions could be scrutinized, debated, and potentially challenged on the world stage. By the end of the 6th week following the announcement, the British public had become deeply divided. Some rallied to defend the monarchy, insisting that the king had done what was necessary to preserve order. But many more, especially younger generations and people of color, demanded justice, transparency, and reform. They didn't just want explanations. They wanted change. The legal and constitutional ground had shifted. What started as a royal decision now threatened to ignite a reformation. Not through violence or revolution, but through the slow, unrelenting force of legal scrutiny and democratic accountability. For weeks following the shocking announcement that her children had been removed from the royal line of succession, Meghan Markle remained silent. The Duchess of Sussex, known for her eloquence, her media savvy, and her ability to command global attention with a single phrase, said nothing. There were no press releases, no interviews, no veiled Instagram posts or leaks to American morning shows. Just silence, a vacuum that only deepened the intrigue surrounding her and intensified public speculation. Some interpreted her quiet as a sign of shock, others as a calculated legal strategy. Pundits and royal commentators debated endlessly about what she was thinking, what she might be planning. Was she preparing a lawsuit? Negotiating a private resolution? Or simply retreating from a system that had so publicly and brutally rejected her children? In Montecito, California, where she and Prince Harry resided, the atmosphere was reportedly tense. Paparazzi camped outside the gates, hoping to catch even a fleeting image of the Duchess. Neighbors told reporters that security around the estate had intensified and sightings of Meghan had virtually ceased. Even those close to the Sussexes said little, citing non-disclosure agreements and respect for the family's privacy. But behind the scenes, Meghan was preparing something she knew would be heard around the world. When her statement finally came, it did not come through a morning show or social media. It came through an exclusive sit-down interview with one of the world's most respected journalists, someone chosen not for ratings but for credibility. The network teased the interview with a 30-second clip. Meghan seated across from the interviewer, her face solemn, her voice clear. "They didn't just strip my children of titles," she said. "They stripped them of identity." The teaser alone was enough to send shockwaves across the globe. Media outlets halted regular programming. Entire front pages were devoted to the upcoming interview. The hashtag Meghan Speaks trended worldwide within hours. And when the full broadcast finally aired during prime time, it drew over 200 million viewers globally, a number rivaling royal weddings and presidential inaugurations. In the interview, Meghan delivered a calm but devastating monologue. She began by describing the moment she learned about the decision. It came not through a personal call, she revealed, but through a palace-issued press release forwarded to her publicist. There was no warning, no conversation, just a cold, official notice that her children were no longer recognized in the royal succession. "What message does that send to them?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What message does that send to every child of mixed race who looks at the royal family and wonders, could I belong?" Her words were pointed, but never overtly angry. She did not name names. She didn't accuse King Charles directly, though the implication was impossible to miss. She framed the decision as part of a wider system, one steeped in history, tradition, and, she carefully suggested, systemic bias. Meghan spoke of the emotional toll the announcement had taken on her family, particularly on Harry, who she described as haunted by the idea that history was repeating itself. He watched his mother be consumed by an institution that claimed to protect her, she said. And now he's watching his children be erased by that same